policies in place need to adapt and brace for these changes. I'm delighted here to introduce our panelists, starting with Karin Huber-Heim, Academic Program Director at Sustainable Finance based in Austria and is an international sustainability expert. We also have Dr. Mladen Domazet from the Institute of Political Ecology based in Croatia, where he researches climate change and post-growth degrowth. We also have Kateřina Davidová, also Katka, a research fellow at EUROPEUM Institute for European Policy and a dear colleague of mine, based in Prague, and her research focuses on issues related to climate change and energy policies. Welcome, everyone. So Karin, if I may, I will turn to you to kick us off with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you very much, Ramjesh. Thank you much to the Global Shapers Prague to invite me to this. I'm always happy to cross borders, especially if it's digitally. So what is possible post-COVID-19? I think a lot. Just to make this clear before I start, I hope you can all see my screen. I am amazed. I have been amazed by what has happened in those past weeks and months. And it made me convinced, or it deeply convinced me that a lot is possible and a lot of good stuff is possible. Thinking about the normal that so many of us, or what I hear on in the conversations when I listen into it, that a lot of people would like to go back to normal. Actually, this normal has failed us, and the crisis now gives us the chance to build better, build back better. And I like to match this to when you move. You're living in an old house that your parents and grandparents have built. It's nice and cozy, but somehow a little bit off and not matching the present and not matching your future. So what if you move now? You have the chance to move. What will you bring into this new world? And the questions that arise for me, at least that I engage with, are will it be economy versus people and planet, or will we manage to create an economy for the people and for the planet? And I think this is one of the core questions, because as much as many of us like now the way that climate has improved, biodiversity, and biosystems are coming back, and we see CO2 levels going down. This is not forever, and we cannot stay home forever or stay in. So we really have to consider this crisis that is waiting for us outside, and once we're going out again, it's gonna be back. So economy has an important role in this, and how we tackle this. So another question that I would love to discuss now with this excellent panel is the systems perspective that are needed. We do not have one crisis. We do not have a health crisis. We do not have one social crisis, and we do not have an environmental crisis. It's a complex crisis with all of those elements affecting several sectors. And economy is part, or is a vital part, or a very influential part in many of those sectors, or areas. So it really needs to be inclusively solved, but we need to look at several aspects that influence each other and that are interdependent. So a silo solution will not do the job, and as much as we are now in a crisis mode where we need to solve several issues, we still have to consider all the other impacts that solving now has, that building back will have, and all the issues that are just waiting for us once we have solved this one. I really see a strong role for youth in building back better, in creating this prosperous, healthy, safe, and just world that actually we all want to have. And rebuilding an economy while also accounting for climate change is certainly an enormous challenge. But we are the generation, and we do have the generations now around, that are the most healthiest, the well-educated, the best educated ones. We have enough money around that we just need to allocate in the right places. We have the technology, we have the knowledge. So actually, we are in a very good place to come back out of this crisis better. And therefore, future generations and youth now really, really matter, because we do not have much time left. So I'm interested in discussing with you, what will this new world look like? Local food, pedestrianized cities, business travel stops, renewables. What will it be like? I'm looking forward to discuss this with you. Thank you.
Great. Karin, thank you so much. So I'd be remiss if I didn't follow up on the generational aspect that you covered in your presentation, given that we're representing global shapers. We have seen the next generation take a really vocal lead on pushing for policy change before the pandemic. How important is it to engage this next generation post-COVID? And also, how do we convince those who are currently in power that climate policies are a good investment now and also in the future?
Convincing politicians is the hardest thing ever. I'm not so sure if we need to keep this fire burning, first of all, to come back to your first point, youth. How can we keep them engaged? We need to keep them engaged, and as much as also young people are now going through several strains in their life because of what is going on right now. I think they are still, most of them are still very much aware that this is their future that we're talking about. It's not my generation's future. So I think they are very well aware of it. But politicians, I have to say, I don't give much to politicians, because they have other time horizons. A politician's time horizon is 5 years, 4 years, if they're lucky. Sometimes if we are not so lucky, they have 8 years or maybe 10 or longer in some countries, but not in general. So this is really something that has to come from society, and it has to come from economy, because economy, actually, a lot of the corporations that I work with really see renewables, energy efficiency, a different way of using resources has a big opportunity for growth, actually, within a certain frame that we're dealing with right now, whether you call it planetary boundaries or regulated frames. So I really see this happening, and I guess that my strong guess would be that the push has to come from those two elements. It won't be politics. Maybe multinational politics like the UN or EU, but national politics, no.
Interesting. I'll touch on the future of kind of the multilateralism aspect later, but I think this is a perfect time to transition to Mladen. You touch a lot on the kind of how society impacts this, so I would love to hear your perspective on this.
Thanks, and thank you to Global Shapers Prague for organizing this. And I've got, for the point of discussion, a lot to agree with Karin's exposition that we started with, except to pick a bone with sustainable growth and technological innovation and shifting the burden to the youths. But let me come back to that towards the end of a little introduction. I would like us to go back and think to what happened to us this spring. At the end of last year, markets were already overheating. There were warnings of a crisis. We ended the year with a reasonable failure of COP25, the Conference of Parties on Climate Change, which took place in Madrid because it couldn't take place in Chile, where this is the year where we have to start implementing the Paris Agreement, and the 25th COP towards the end of last year was a chance to start putting those mechanisms as to how we work out how the Paris Agreement actually works on the ground into practice, and we failed that, and we ended up with a reasonably toothless global agreement that comes into force this year, where we are not going to have a COP multilateral meeting this year. It's now proposed that it will move towards the end of next year, which makes a difference to a lot of the technical agreements and a lot of the legal instruments we have to put in place. We also have about a decade, even less now, to turn the ocean liner before crossing crucial tipping points in climate system. And we were told before the spring that nothing could be done, that things were too deeply set in, nobody wants to move, even if I want to change, others don't. And the fossil growth economy is really the tracks we continued driving on, even when we suited ourselves with small shifts to gas instead of coal. And then the pandemic erupted, and this time it was a pandemic in the developed world, and everyone noticed. So wealthiest countries got paralyzed, including most of Europe. And the lesson we've learned, lesson number one, was that we could halt the economy very quickly without an utmost collapse. This was done by a simple virus that showed us that it was possible, and we've done it in Europe. And even though we're partially opening up now and quickly forgetting, the lesson is still there that we can do it, and we could do it when we needed to. We also learned the lesson number two, that life does go on without a lot of the superfluous stuff, like some travel and meetings. The slowdown invited a lot of us to reassess the true value of things, whether we need fewer goods and more connections. We relied suddenly much more on the commons and solidarity and public services to preserve our well-being. Of course, there were tragic examples, and most importantly, there was deepening of inequality that was built into the system that is still something we have to contend with. And then looking ahead, we're looking at the deepest economic depression in a century, shock to the system. That is really a chance to rebuild it differently, something along the lines of a New Deal. We're going to face a crisis of solvency, not just liquidity. So we really will have to ask ourselves towards the end of the year how we feed ourselves, how we heat our communities, and where's all that global stuff going? All that stuff that we were moving to the extent that we were the largest geological force on the planet in the last decade. So we need to refuse the desperate economic recovery of the old normal, as Karin said, because it would be unfair, dangerous, and irrational. It would be unfair because the inequalities were already large, and they were only heightened through the pandemic. Think about those people who had to get to work without suddenly having bus services because they were cancelled, versus those people who could work from home and whose productivity, in a way, continued almost unabated, except for a few baby feet appearing in the camera. We suddenly realized that care was neglected and devalued, and it had proven to be absolutely necessary in the condition of a crisis. We realized suddenly a huge importance of public services, which were cracking under strain. So these are not just hospitals that we've had a focus on. Think about the schools and how is our schooling continuing and has been continuing through the lockdown and the shift to digital, what it means for children's well-being, what it means for socializing, what it eventually means for the grades that they're attaining to get in order to join various professional roles in society. Likewise with our transport, etc. The old normal is also dangerous because growth and climate impacts are highly conjoined. There's no green growth, there's no decoupling, there's no magic carbon removal. And the projections for the entire economic depression this year are to reduce the annual emissions globally by 10%. So that's virtually no drop in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, because only what the output is for this year would be reduced by 10%. We need to reduce it by 90% this year and next year and the year after and all the years after that. And we cannot get this 90% reduction simply through lockdown and consequences measures. We need a systemic restructuring of the economy along the degrowth line. And finally, it would also be irrational to start the old normal, because in Europe, the shutdown of a large part of production chains has only had limited impact on the quality of life. Think about the fact that we didn't run out of toilet paper, we didn't run out of fresh vegetables. A lot of our life systems can go on, even when we shut down a lot of what we call the economy. So the question for us rationally is, are we to go back to our market-created needs as if nothing's happened and we've simply had a small break, like a period of short sick leave, and then we're running back to work to catch up with what we've done, especially with what we know about the overall climate crisis. And in that respect, I unashamedly have to propose a degrowth philosophy and guiding constraints of the type that we can see on the slide for the degrowth donut developed by the Institute for Political Ecology here. We need a planned decarbonization of life system that reaches truly net zero by 2050, and at the same time ignores the effects on the quantified GDP output. That does not mean ignoring its effects on food supply, on health support, but in fact to measure those effects through different indicators like the ones we're showing on the degrowth donut. We need a transition to sustainable and just forms of social organization. That means degrowing energy and material throughput, but also reorienting entire economic activity to redistribute shared wealth. As Karin has pointed out, we have a lot of that. We are the richest continent in the world, in order to meet people's needs and enhance their well-being in a just and fair way for everyone in Europe and globally. There's a lot of literature available on this because I can't summarize everything in these few minutes. It focuses both on reduction of environmental impact, also on redistribution of wealth and income, and then also on the cultural change of transition from materialistic to a convivial society. What kind of quantitative guidance could we have for that is precisely presented by our idea of a degrowth donut, which grows from planetary boundaries, visualizations, and Kate Roberts' donut economics, where we simply say we can, for every society, try and quantify those elements which are already burdening the planet, the fair share of the burden on the planet excessively on the outer rim, that definitely need to be reduced, or if you want, literally degrown. And then those aspects which we need to grow to achieve climate restoration, like forested areas, like wilderness protection, all of those things which are coming into other treaties that we've heard coming out of the European Union, like dedicating farming land to organic farming, etc. And when we put those themes through a set of indicators around a donut shape, then what we really want to achieve is to keep the jam inside, i.e. to have no red bars of crossing the boundaries of failures on the thresholds on the inside, in cultural, socioeconomic, and biophysical aspects. And we can see where present or just pre-crisis situation of every country is through a large database of publicly available data, and then downscaled to national size and fair share burdens, and then develop policies for countries or groups of countries which aim to work on the strengths where those countries already sit inside the donut in the green zone without the red bars, and then also policies on how to reduce or eliminate the red bars. Some of these proposals that degrowth philosophy would put forward would be universal basic income that leads to eventually unconditional autonomy allowance, which combines the monetary income that is suggested in the universal basic income with a broader set of life provisions and services that as a society we can provide without giving them a quantified financial or monetary tag, and in that way reducing again the race to price competition. Through also relocalizing food production, we literally need to, in Europe, use every inch that is available that doesn't burden the biodiversity to grow food. So our cities need to become much more green. We need to use our green surfaces in the cities also to provide basic local food production, and also access to communal food growing for the people, so that you're not just buying it as an input whilst you're working on heavy other stuff like texts and webinars, as I do, but to actually go and get your fingers dirty and learn where the food is coming from and how you could rely on it in times of crises. That also does probably involve nationalizing and planning for basic health and sanitation provisions, water, types of monopoly transport like railways, etc. And ideologically, we need to re-embed the economy back in the society, and the society back in the Living Earth network, which again is the philosophy behind the creation of this indicator ring like a donut. A lot of that kind of strategies and philosophies will be presented and debated at the Vienna conference on degrowth, which is starting on Friday and is going on through the next weekend, and then the Manchester and Den Haag degrowth conferences, which will take place in 2021. The Vienna conference at the moment is taking place entirely digitally because of the restrictions on travel still. So that's a new experiment in having an event of that size taking place entirely digitally. So for the purposes of our discussion, I have to say that I would disagree with Karin that we can have sustainable growth and hope to reach the climate target of no more than 1.5 degrees average temperature rise. And also, whilst we have a duty to youth and European strategies are mentioning that, I have an experience that a lot of the times we wanted to make transformational strategies in the past, we've been shifting them either onto youth or to education. So whenever a transformation was required, we said, okay, let's first develop an educational curriculum that will speak to or address the required transformation, but that basically shifts it down to another generation. Whilst we need to speak to youth as to exactly what kind of planet and exactly what kind of Europe we're leaving to them, we also need to start enacting these measures right now and not wait for the next generation, because there really is no time until crucial tipping points are crossed in a planetary system. I would stop there, and I look forward to a conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Mladen. Just a really quick follow-up question. For the degrowth model, where we basically need to consume less and fewer materials and resources, and given that there will be a focus on regrowth, which will probably be regrowing and using more things, who do we need to take charge of this transition? Is it governments, is it corporations, or is it society, as you refer to?
Well, ideally it is society, but to tie in with the question you posed to Karin, we really need to create our own political actors or lobby the existing political actors to come on board with the urgency. I hesitate to say emergency, because that usually results in giving violent powers to existing ruling elites, which did not do anything on the issue. But to understand the urgency politically and to push forward that really small changes or cosmetic changes are not the part of the debate. Either those who are ready to lead into a continent, and this has to be a continent-wide change, because metabolically we're not sufficient enough societies. We don't want small autarkic societies around Europe all producing all of their cabbages. We can still move our cabbages around Europe, but it's ridiculous to move salmon from Europe to South Asia and then back to Europe for consumption, and those kind of supply chains have to end. But really, there are political actors arising along the lines of degrowth stream. It is still an offensive word in a lot of the normal parlance, but behind the word, there is a lot of strategies which I think a lot of the political actors are taking up when they seriously realize the precipice that we are standing on now.
I understand. Great. Thank you. And moving to Kateřina, where you're going to give us a little bit more on those policy perspectives, and love to hear your presentation on that.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot to Global Shapers Prague for inviting me. I actually at first wanted to start with the EU policies that are now in the pipeline as part of the Green Deal, but actually I think the second part of my presentation ties a bit more to what Mladen was talking about, so maybe I'll skip to that and then get back to the EU level after, and I'll try and be quick, and I'll try to move the presentation. Okay, so we're gonna skip this, and I just wanted to sort of complement what Mladen was saying about the fall of emissions. This is a graph which shows exactly how the emissions fell during the sort of the peak of the pandemic around the world. We see that in China it was a particular big drop, and then other countries followed suit as the pandemic spread around the world. And at the peak of the lockdown policies, there was a drop of 17% of emissions compared to the same time last year, which is quite a substantial drop, it might seem. Also, if we look at it from a historical perspective, it's a much larger drop than, for example, the Second World War was, which was the biggest so far in the history that we can sort of relate to. It was also a larger drop than the financial recessions and the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. So this would seem like, okay, the measures weren't ideal, but at least we saw a drop in emissions. But the problem with CO2 emissions and climate change is that they accumulate in the atmosphere, as it can be seen in this bathtub allegory, where basically the atmosphere is the tub. And we keep pumping emissions every year, and only a certain fraction of those emissions can actually be removed through natural removals, such as forests or oceans. But the majority of those emissions stays in the atmosphere for many years. And so even if now we would see a drop of, let's say, those 17%, which probably it won't be that much, probably till the end of the year, it's going to be something around the 10% that Mladen mentioned. It still isn't enough to sort of reverse the effects of climate change. And we might actually hear it from some climate skeptics that, okay, now we basically stopped everything and the emissions dropped, so why isn't climate change getting better? Because it can't, because the CO2 emissions are still there and they're going to be there for many years. And actually the UN estimates that in order to keep the warming of the global temperature to 1.5 degrees, we would need to remove roughly 7.6% of global emissions every year, or reduce. So we would basically need what we've seen this year, we would need it every single year from now until 2050 at least. And ideally it would also be sort of accelerating so that every year we remove a bit more. Okay, so that's what I wanted to sort of complement what Mladen was saying before. And maybe one more note to that is that even though we see this huge drop to 17%, there is still this other 83% of emissions that were still being pumped to the atmosphere, even though our lives practically stopped. We weren't traveling anywhere, we weren't seeing our family, we weren't going to work, or some people were, but not everyone. And yet 83% of the emissions still went up. And this, I think, shows really well why we need a systemic solution to climate change and not just individual actions, because even if basically all the airlines stop flying, we still don't see such a big drop. So it's the systems that we have based on fossil fuels, such as energy, transportation and industry, that we really need to address if we want to have some long-term stable reduction of emissions that's necessary. And maybe I would just show you the last slide which I had there, which to me actually shows that maybe even though this crisis isn't the solution definitely to climate change, it can be an interesting catalyst to that. And not because of governments per se, but mostly because of the economy, the real economy, where we have seen a sharp decline in demand for fossil fuels such as oil and coal, and sharp increase in demand for renewables, such as this picture from Germany illustrates. It's a comparison of the first quarter of 2020 to 2019. And we see that while the demand dropped all over the country, it was actually the renewables that were the only ones that actually saw an increase in demand and in output, unlike all the other sources of energy. And it was quite similar, for example, on the car market in Britain, where suddenly electric vehicles were the only ones that were being bought as the demand dropped dramatically. People still wanted to buy EVs and not the diesel or petrol cars. And we see this all over the place also, for example, with investments and green bonds suddenly increasing in their value compared to more like ordinary corporate bonds. So I think this actually could be the first step to some sort of more systemic change, but obviously for that we need a really good policy framework. We can't just leave it to the markets sort of to go its way. And now we go back to what I wanted to start with initially, which is one example of such policy framework that we have here in the EU, the European Green Deal. It was presented already before the crisis in December last year, but now it's sort of being used as a framework for the recovery money that the EU will put together and will redistribute across the member states. This should be sort of the framework on which this money should be used. And it covers several areas apart from energy and transport. It also covers, for example, circular economy and the use of waste for something else than just basically landfilling it. It covers reform of common agriculture policy and the farm to fork strategy, where it should sort of decrease the span of agricultural products from when they're produced and to when the consumers actually take them. It should cover also a just transition for the most carbon reliant regions, such as the coal mining regions. And obviously it also covers the financial aspect of it. And we can perhaps talk about whether it's ambitious enough or isn't. It's being criticized by green groups for not being ambitious enough. But on the other hand, I think that right now it's really good to have some sort of framework ready, which can be used in this turbulent times as a sort of stepping stone for where we need to get. And just yesterday, the European Commission unveiled its new proposal for the next EU budget, and together with the new recovery package, it's called the Next Generation EU, and it's a huge package of money. Together, both the EU budget and the recovery package, they make up almost 2 trillion euros, and now it's going to be really crucial where this money goes to. And so it's still pretty new. There will be details coming up in the next couple of days, and it will have to be discussed and negotiated by all the member states and the European Parliament. So we can expect that there's going to be some changes to the final budget. But we already see that the Commission is trying to push for green and digital recovery, with the word green being repeated very much in all the Commission communications. But if we look at this proposal more closely, we see that actually some of the most efficient tools to ensure a green transition or green recovery are not there. So for example, there is still lacking some clear green conditionality on how member states can use this money that will be made available to them. And that's, I think, in my opinion, that's the biggest flaw, because we already see that lots of EU money, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, it's being spent on projects that actually create more emissions than they reduce. So it's very counterproductive. And if there are no clear safeguards, no clear earmarking on part of the European Commission for how this money can be used, then we can expect that the member states will just sort of use it on whatever they want. They can use it on fossil fuels, they can use it to build highways, airports, and so on. So yes, I think in order to make it really the keystone of a green recovery, there needs to be much clearer conditionality on what this money can be used on. And I'm going to end there, and I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, Kateřina, I'll get everyone's take on kind of this new recovery policy, but I wanted just to hear from you, because only Czech Republic very recently came into support of the Green Recovery Plan and the EU Green Deal just, weeks ago. So kind of what was some of the obstacles that Central and Eastern Europe specifically have been having towards these policies, and what can get them on board kind of moving forward? Can COVID-19 post-pandemic, economic recovery be the key to that?
Okay, so yeah, Czech Republic only came out openly, I think, last week in support of the EU Green Deal. Slovakia actually did it before us, so they were the first one from this region, I believe, to support it. And yeah, Poland, I don't think they supported it yet, and same with some other countries. I mean, it's clearly down to some basic economics, because these countries are much more reliant on either heavy industry such as the Czech Republic, or automotive industry such as Slovakia and the Czech Republic, or they have very dirty energy mixes such as Poland or the Czech Republic. So when they look at it and they count, okay, how much reaching net zero by 2050 is going to cost us, they see that it's going to be much more costly than, for example, for Denmark, which is already way ahead in that area. But I think it's also ideological, because leaders in these countries, they only focus on the costs and they don't really focus on the benefits. And I think that's due to ideology, because if they looked at the benefits or some sort of cost benefit analysis, they would have to see that there are, of course, lots of opportunities in decarbonization for our countries. We can become leaders in some areas, for example, manufacturing components for renewable energy. We can be, for example, renovation of buildings that will decrease the energy intensity of buildings. That would just be a win-win for everyone, because you provide jobs, you reduce emissions, you can reduce energy poverty, which is quite high in these countries, and so on. So I believe that most of the obstacles in these countries are actually political or ideological rather than based on the economy.
Karin, Mladen, do you have responses to that?
Yeah, I can only agree to what Mladen and Kateřina said. I find it very interesting, and this is one of the things that I would want to imagine that are possible in post-COVID times. Governments around Europe and around the world have started to listen to science. And I really like to see this, that they have scientists, that they have task force, and they have experts from various fields to advise them and who consult them and on how to tackle the current crisis. So this is actually what I would like to see happen also when we talk about the climate crisis and how to tackle it economically. Because yes, we will need to help entrepreneurs, because if we always talk about economy, this is such an anonymous system. In fact, it's all people, and it's people who are running companies, it's people who founded them, it's people who employ other people, it's people who work there, and this creates a lot of not knowing or a lack of information on what is possible or what would be possible, creates fear, because not everyone knows what we are talking about right now. Not everyone knows what could be possible, which kind of technologies or models we already have to tackle this. And I think this also refers very much, unfortunately, to politicians. It's not that they know everything. It's not that they are experts on everything. Most of them actually are no experts at all in anything but politics. And so this is why I would really like to see advisory boards for politicians, for policymakers, how to tackle these crises. And it doesn't mean that they necessarily need to let go all the people in the ministries, because there are experts on topics as well, but still bring people in from the outside, bring in other thinking, out of the box thinking. This refers also to politics, not just to corporations and entrepreneurship. I would like to see this happen.
I would like to comment. I wish we were sitting in the same room, then we could exchange much faster. This is still like a conference call. But on the question of Eastern Europe versus, for instance, Denmark, it's always interesting that in Denmark, we hear great examples of summer electricity production and consumption when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, but not a about the winter days when Denmark is still, like Eastern European countries, burning a lot of fossil fuels to keep its heavy-going economy through the dark winter days. And that needs, again, a serious restructuring as well. But our research throughout the years has shown that populations in Eastern Europe are much more in agreement with a broad degrowth strategy of lower throughput and greater sharing. And in some respects, that means greater state control, because we need to agree who it is, and democratically represented governments are still the best choice of who governs what is public, what belongs to everyone, what is shared, and it's shared in order to have a smaller footprint so that we don't all accumulate individually and compete with each other. Now, Eastern Europe does have a bad experience with transition capitalism, and it also has a bad experience with transition capitalism going hand in hand with lack of solidarity in Europe. So a lot of the development we've seen in transition times is focused, like the Budapest fourth line, on bringing tourists from the airport to the city center, but not bringing more Budapestis to their places of work or hospitals they need to go to, etc. These are the kind of great development, growth, spurring investments that we've had throughout Europe. And now we need to sit down and seriously talk what it is that Eastern Europe, as well as Western Europe, needs in terms of climate resilience throughout this century. And seriously, climate resilience is the biggest challenge for all of us, even with COVID still going on. And in that respect, Eastern Europe is often, again, in a longer presentation, I would show you that through the donuts, is often better positioned because its burden, its systems, however dirty they are in coal and they need to transition to renewable, are still less burdening. The whole throughput is much lower in these societies than it is in the societies of the West. And in that respect, if we need to all reduce throughput, there's less of a material change for Eastern European populations. And I think populations understand that. What they lack is a political option that would put that together. Our social research, again, partial and never super universal, because we never had massively large sample of all Europeans. We're inferring from proxy data. We're working with comparative social research on samples of a few thousand per country. It does show that Eastern Europeans have less of a techno-optimistic hope of simply solving this without social change. They have a greater experience of social change, and they do have inherited or shared practices of communal and therefore less impact in aggregate, less impact economies and practices, and sustaining their daily lives. So I think there is potential there, but we need to find a way to articulate that potential politically if we're going to go through democratic representation, which I think is the only serious and is the necessary way. Neither the corporations nor specific fringe changes will lead us there to a resilient and good life in 21st century.
Great. So before we turn to some Q&A from the audience, I do want to pose a quick question to you guys. And this is something you guys have all touched on, is the importance of good leadership. Obviously, at this moment, EU is leading the way on various initiatives, but this is a global problem, both with the pandemic and climate change. So how do we get other partner countries, also other high carbon emitters, to make this change in step with Europe? So just throw it to whoever wants to start first. Karin.
Well, there is a plan, and this is something that I strongly promote because I'm also in the board of the Austrian Global Compact Network, and the United Nations have a plan for a better future, which is called the Agenda 2030, or Sustainable Development Goals, global goals. And this is a vision for our life on this planet. Starting by 2030, we were reaching it by 2030, all the way to 2050, to become a more sustainable society, living within planetary boundaries, thriving, being healthy, having just and fair systems, equality. So this paints a picture and has a set of 169 targets with indicators, not perfect, but doable, or let's say a good start to give governments around the globe and 193 states have already agreed that this is the vision that we all want to achieve. So it's a matter of implementing them on a national level, which is different for every country, not only in Europe, east, west, north, south, but also globally, north, south, or east, west. And this is actually something that is already happening, even though we are not talking much about these goals. It is happening, and just looking at the Green Deal, at the EU Green Deal, it tackles several of the goals, from affordable energy to leave no one behind, human rights, fair transition, equality or inequalities. It has a lot of that has in it, and this is what the goals are about. They are the policies that are going to happen and are happening already for the future, whether it's China or even the US. We don't hear about it, but it's happening.
I agree that there are a lot of movements, but there's a lot of ways that Europe, even with the best intentions, is lagging behind. It needs to break free from the chains of mobile capital. We need to cut loose of the fear that if we do make changes which are life-preserving, the money will simply run out and hide in Bermuda. The money that hides in Bermuda still eats the food and enjoys the fun that is produced and happens in Europe. And in that respect, on a global level, Europe needs to both look fairly in the eye of the, say, African group of nations and say, we have done our commitments on the 100 billion. We will raise them even more because the adaptation globally is the global issue. The adaptation that does not happen and the adjustment that does not happen in Africa will come to Europe's door in the most horrible way that we see of people drowning in the Mediterranean. And then we need to also look into the eyes of our, how shall I say, rich global North partners and say, no more trade without climate protection. Because the system is global now. Nobody acts on their own. Europe would be risking a lot of the break in the production and supply chains, but it's also a large and rich continent, and perhaps with diverse experiences that it contains, it can weather or start that transition in a reasonably resilient way, and then say to the other polluters, you're not going to go it alone. And, you know, we do have the trust of the global south with us, but that trust has been severely eroded in the last years since the Paris Agreement. We all signed up to 1.5, but then for 5 years failed to enact any proper mechanisms to reach that 1.5, to the point that the African nations are now left in the hug of the Saudi Arabia, which is saying, look, you will have all your material development that you need, and people still need hospitals, they need schools, and you'll have it on my cheap oil because these other guys, they're promising you a lot, but they never deliver. And look, I've got it here. I've got the barrels already stocked. I've got the technology to get it going. So just say yes, and we'll do the continuous dirty development. And we need to regain that trust with the global south. And that is really by stopping to play this green capital versus black capital game and say, okay, this is a crisis century. Now we need coordination. It doesn't have to stay that way forever. Let the entrepreneurs play in the zones that they can, but not to the detriment of life preservation and basic public services that a rich society at the start of the 21st century can afford.
Kateřina, any response to that?
Yeah, maybe just, I definitely agree with what Karin and Mladen said. On the EU side, there is also this instrument that's perceived in the European Green Deal called the carbon border tax, which on one hand, it should help sort of preserve the competitiveness of European industries and producers, but on the other hand, it's also a tool that will sort of push producers from outside of the EU to reduce the carbon intensity of their products. It would technically mean that if some product comes to the EU, which is from a country that hasn't got such stringent climate regulations and emission regulations, there would be an extra tax on top of it, which would make it less competitive on our market. And I think that in global scale, this could really be a a really useful tool that would help level the scope, level the playing field a bit, and maybe persuade some countries to also look at how their products are produced. And on geopolitical terms, I think it's very crucial how the new relationship between EU and China will pan out. There's this big summit planned for September in Leipzig between EU and China, where climate will be also one of the top priorities. And I think that whatever comes out of that will sort of show us the way how it's going to be in the next couple of years. And if we don't manage to get China on board to reduce their emissions, then yeah, the whole sort of climate ambition will suffer a really big blow. But let's hope that it's not going to happen. And
I think we will get China on board to reduce emissions, because China makes emissions to make stuff for us. So if we don't buy that stuff, then China doesn't have a quick fix where to sell it. But okay, I'm no expert on global politics, but I'd like to ask Kateřina, do you think we could up the game from carbon border tax to carbon border ban? Because with the tax, we're still talking about the price mechanism. And as we know, especially in neoliberal world of the last few decades, you can always expand to lower your price by pressing on workers more. If you're asked to protect the environment, maybe you can squeeze the poor populations more. What if we said no imports where environmental regulations and human rights regulations are not respected? Not even at any price, not even with the tax we put on. We simply don't take that stuff. We are breaking a lot of the chains of global circulation, but we're going to have to break them anyway due to the carbon impact of shipping all that stuff back and forth. But do you think we could dare to say nothing dirty comes in? We don't live on the dirty products, even when we can afford to pay them.
I definitely like the idea. I think it's quite a bold one. I honestly, it's hard to say for me whether it would be politically feasible or not. I would say, like, before this crisis, probably not, but I think this sort of shaken everyone's like paradigms about how the world should be. And perhaps, I mean, I haven't really seen it suggested in any sort of policy memo on the EU level, but yeah, I mean, I think right now nothing is impossible. So
that's a good thought.
Any other questions kind of amongst our panelists? I mean, you guys had some conflicting ideas, some in common, but I think this is a great place to debate these topics, because there is no easy right answer that we're not going to be able to solve this overnight, but I think this is a long discussion. So I want to turn it back to our panelists to see if you guys have any questions, but also maybe perhaps even closing remarks, anything you kind of want to leave the audience with.
I would like to come back to Mladen's presentation because I'm also a very, very big admirer and very big fan of the donut model, because I think this is a visualization also, a tool for visualization also that shows countries, but also of course other organizations, cities or corporations, but very much countries and policymakers. Where is the limit for growth, and where have we already crossed the boundaries? Where can we not grow, and where can we grow? So because Mladen, you also touched the for corporates, this is the devil word, degrowth. This is where all the corporates jump up and leave the room, because they do not have an economic model to thrive without unlimited growth. This is what we got taught for the past 50 years. This is the economic model, and it raises fear and anger and awe when people like us or me mention this with corporates in the room, or with even with economists in the room, because they lose control, or they think they lose control, because there is no other way to thrive, which is not true any longer under the given circumstances that we have now. Because this matched the 70s and the 60s, where we came out of war. We could grow, and we couldn't see an end of that growth. But now we're very much seeing that end, and not only that, we have reached end in many of the areas already. So I think there will be growth still, let's see what will happen in 50 years, but still there is room for growth, but in other areas. And maybe that growth, and this is also one of the flaws in our economic system, is that we measure everything in monetary value. And this is a flaw. We need to rethink value, not only from the point of a circular economy with material value and all that, but we really have to consider what is of value to us, to everyone, not just for some. And this, I think, is a discussion that is already going on, and it will have to go public. It should go out of those esoteric circles like ours. It should really go out, and this is where also again, politicians, but also other decision makers need some sort of coaching, even, because they don't have the tools. And some people already have tools, and everyone is screaming for solutions, but we do not have those solutions yet, but we have tools. So we should get going, and I think there is enough room still for our generations or for the next two to grow. Maybe not in Europe or in the US, because we are very rich countries and we are at the boundaries. But for many other countries, there is still growth, and we can contribute to that growth.
Excellent. Any additional remarks from Mladen or Kateřina?
Well, from my part, I agree with most of it, and I really don't. Neither I nor my colleagues in the degrowth movement enjoy raising hell, and the point isn't to offend people we speak to, even when they're corporate leaders. The point is that we had to seek a word that cannot be co-opted. So many good terms that we've developed in asking for transformation had just been co-opted for business as usual, and you just get a label from green onwards. And then this is a sort of a word that we can still own that cannot be so easily co-opted because it has this negative prefix. But there are so many things that need to grow. Our forested area has to grow in Europe because we cut down our forests in pre-modern times, and we need to grow them back. Our agricultural land under organic-like practices or biodynamic practices has to grow because we need to grow more quality food locally. Our wilderness protection zones, so that biodiversity would have safe havens, need to grow. And those are the things, among with human well-being and access to education and health self-perception, that need to grow even in Europe. Throughput and energy use need to reduce because we don't have the technological systems at the moment to have larger throughput of materials and energy without having an environmental impact. As a physicist, I would say we can't even have them. Let's not hope for irrational. But there's still room for human innovation in so many sectors. But let's focus that innovation on social organization. Let's use what we have so that we can share it better, rather than fighting over getting proprietary pieces and therefore squeezing others out and forcing them to go and grab more from nature or the commons. I would like to see an explanation as to why European Green Deal still mentions growth about 20 times, even when you speak to the officials and they say, we don't mean economic growth, we mean growth of well-being, when actually they don't say growth of well-being, they say economic growth in the document. But perhaps that is a question for our both political and intellectual stream to push on and to demand from politicians an understanding.
And I know, Kateřina, you've been working very a lot on this issue. So I know we have a lot to do at EUROPEUM on these issues. So thank you so much, you guys, for joining us. I'm very mindful of our time. Just to quickly wrap up, I mean, I think we just showed that this pandemic shows us how interconnected we are. We're dealing with the faceless and borderless issue, both with climate change and the pandemic. So we need really coordinated measures to overcome this, and hopefully this crisis can be a catalyst for some change. And I wouldn't say economic growth, but growth and well-being. Thank you, Mladen. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our fantastic group of experts for being here today, and also for the Global Shapers and European Institute for Global Policy for hosting and co-hosting today. So thank you guys, and have a great day.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Mladen and Kateřina. It was great to meet you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the discussion. Bye.